So first off, a bondman, this is where it comes from, is bondman. The argument will come from the Old Testament where they talk about bondmen. And bondman is the issue of this because they say bondmen are slaves. Now, the actual word slave only appears 2 times in the Bible. The actual word slave only appears 2 times in the King James Bible. And both of those times they are condemnations. And the reason for this is because the writers of the King James in 1611 understood that everything in the Bible, a servant, a bondman, and a slave, what they had were not the same thing. Now, in other modern translations, and once again, this is why I don't like these modern translations, they'll replace servant with slave. That's not the same thing. But in the King James, they separate it because they want you to know that it's not the same thing. So modern versions do this to their own hurt. So bondman, obviously, we wouldn't agree with bondman today either, but it's a far cry from slavery. So let's look at the Bible. So what is our argument against bondman? First off, let's look at the argument from the Bible during the time of slavery in the U.S. Granville Sharp wrote this book called The Just Limitations of Slavery and the Laws of God Compared with the Unbounded Claims of the African Traders and British American Slaveholders. Put that on a title on the front of your book. That's a big title. But nonetheless, this is how they did their books. And so this is what he did. And what they would do is at that time in the United States, they'd say, but the Jews had bondmen. The Jews had bondmen. And so he argues from the standpoint of the bondman. And he shows this is not the same thing as what is happening. And he starts off Leviticus 25, 44 through 46. They could purchase from the heathen around them. They were not allowed to steal bondmen. They were only allowed to purchase bondmen. And they were not allowed to purchase bondmen who were stolen. That's a big difference than the slave trade. Already we've got a difference. So how did you become a bondman? You became a debtor, or you broke the law, or you did some sort of evil that caused you to be a bondman. And they were only allowed to do it to the heathen that were around them. There's a few different ones, and I'm going to get into that, but they were only allowed to do this to the Canaanites, where there's any sort of discrepancy and evil, as we would perceive it today. It was only allowed with the Canaanites. I'm going to get why. And these were the nations that were defiled. And listen to this. Canaan, the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land, therefore, is defiled. Therefore, I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. So now God has condemned Canaan. So they're different than slaves today because we have no Canaanites that were slaves. Jews took over and eradicated the Canaanites. So they were commanded to show the inhabitants of Canaan no mercy. So only the bondman they could have is the Canaanite and the Israeli. There were two, and there were different rules for the two. So Moses said, if a stranger sojourn with thee, this is important to note, ye shall not vex him. But the stranger that dwelleth with you shall be unto you as one born among you, and thou shalt love him as thyself. Sound, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself? Or you wonder where it comes from? Moses. For ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. So it's very clear the same slavery that we had back then is not the same here. Deuteronomy 10, 17 through 19. The Lord your God is a God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and terrible God, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, and loveth the stranger, and giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Then you also have, it says, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Once again in Exodus. And again, thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee. Deuteronomy. We must therefore necessarily conclude when these very opposite commands are considered that the heathen or nations that were round about, this isn't Deuteronomy, this is a quote from his book, that were round about or in the environs of the promised land, and also the children of the strangers that dwelt among them, mentioned at the same time, whom the Israelites were permitted to retain in perpetual bondage, were not intended to be included and ranked under that general denomination of strangers. So the heathen were not to be put in and lumped in as a lump sum with strangers. The Canaanites were not those strangers of the land. The reason why is they were set aside for destruction. They're set aside for destruction. You say, why is that? Now, if you haven't heard this before, many of you have heard exactly what happened with Baal worship, but if you're not so certain, Baal worship was the most cruel and tormentuous thing you can imagine. They would grab men and they would eunuchize them as actual slaves. That's what they did, and they still do it. Even today, Arabs still have slaves. They still have slaves and they eunuchize men. What they would do is they would eunuchize the man, they would make him into a eunuch, and he would be a slave for Baal if they captured him. If they captured the women, they would use them as a sex slave in their worship for Baal. And if they captured a baby, they would take the baby, and they had a golden statue of Baal or an iron statue of Baal, whatever it might be, and they would have its arms out like this. And there'd be an oven right here in the center of its belly or chest, and they would have it like this, and the entire thing would get so hot that it would be searing the hands. They would stick the baby on the hands and wait till it cooked alive on one side. They would then roll it one time and cook the baby again on the other side. Roll it again, the entire time the baby's screaming, until it finally went into the oven. I don't know about you, but a people that not only condones it, but has it in their government to do such a thing, is a people that needs destroyed. There's nothing more disgusting in my mind than that. There is a reason for righteous anger, and righteous anger is necessary. This is the people who were condemned by God. And the best thing that could happen if you were a Canaanite is to be sold as to a Jewish bondman. They're like, yes, I know it's bad it's not great, but it's a lot better than where I'm at. Because you never know what's going to happen over here. And it's still nothing like what slavery was today. So there are two reasons that this is used in arguments. There's two reasons that this argument is used. First off, the person genuinely doesn't know and just read a select verse for the point of the argument. I find that the most common. They genuinely don't know. And so what they'll do is they'll look up online and they'll find reasons Christianity is false, and then people will quote the Old Testament. And they'll quote the bondman, and they'll quote new versions that have the word slave there intentionally. They'll intentionally quote newer versions that end up using the word slave there. It's not a slave. And anyone who does so, it's a mistranslation, because they're not the same thing. And then second off, the person is intentionally leading you astray. It's one of those two. So now let's look at point number 2. So first off, bondmen were not slaves. But instead, I want to show you bondmen were limitations on the way you can treat men. It was not a condoning of actions. It was not a command or praise. And whenever God came in, he didn't say, okay, you shall have slaves. No, he said, if you are going to, I'm going to put some limitations down. So it's important when you read the Old Testament and you read about bondmen, it's not condoning it. And you're going to see why. Instead, it was a limitation placed on the way you treated people. Pro-slavery individuals would quote the same verses and also omit the same verses as debaters do today. So whenever you have, and this is really fascinating, okay, this is amazingly fascinating that you have both sides, right? So you have the one side over here that's saying they're not Christians. Christians aren't great. They don't have the highest level of morality. Why? Because of slavery. And they'll quote the same verse that the slavery people would quote that didn't believe in God at all and say, aha, see? So they're both saying the same thing. I find that very fascinating. They use the same verse and omit the same verses in their arguments for slavery and Christianity. Both of them do. So if you lived back in 1860, this would work. If you use it today, it's going to work. First off, a Canaanite bondman. There were Canaanite bondmen. So there were different types. And these were those that were condemned. There were definitely a lot more freedoms in what you could do with the Canaanite bondmen. You were not allowed to steal them from their land. You still had to purchase them. They had to be sold to you, and they couldn't have been stolen. Either way, there's no way they can't be stolen. There were Canaanite bondmen. Then the second one was the Hebrew bondmen. They were allowed to enslave their own people. That doesn't make any sense. If it's slavery, why were they able to do it with their own people? Because they were bondmen. They're not the same thing. All of them were freed on the 7th year with food and provision. Every 7th year they were freed. Then there were debtors. There were those that went into debt, both strangers and Hebrews. All freed, not Canaanite. Obviously that might fall in a different category. Not actually sure how it works with the Canaanites. But they were all freed on the 7th year with food and provision. They obviously omit that fact too. They were slaves. Of course, they were freed every 7 years. If we did it that way, we would have no slavery. We would have never had a problem with slavery. Slavery would have been gone a long time ago. So it must be translated, and debtors must be treated like a hired hand. Leviticus 25, 40, and 53. They were not to be hurt in any way. Workload should not exceed their physical strength. A fugitive slave, get this. Tell me if this sounds just like the Virginia slave codes. A fugitive slave must not be turned over to his master, but be given refuge. That sounds just like the slave codes where, if you caught the slave, they could be beat to death. Sounds just the same, right? Obviously, that's a bondman. Then there's the criminals, the POWs from war. Then there's the female slaves. Now, if you were to take a female slave that was unmarried, you were required to marry them. Think of that. You were required to marry the female slave. And they are free from their master. They're free if the master's sons deny them matrimony, they're free. So even if they were sold and they were supposed to be sold as slaves, so to speak, they were actually sold for marriage. So once again, and there's another reason they could be freed is if there was any bodily injury, including in marriage. They were allowed to be freed. That's not the same as a slave. Then there's bondman benefits. Here's the benefits of a bondman. Tell me if a slave would be like, you know what? I would be okay with this. You get to keep all of the holidays of the Jews, and they were required to feed you all the meals that the Jews would get. They were not allowed to force them to work on the Sabbath day, any bondman, regardless. This goes for all of them. They must let them partake in every Jewish feast. And then the fourth one, if there is no direct issue upon the master's death, if the master does not write a will, the bondmen inherit the estate. Now, how many places do you know that if the master dies, the slaves inherit the estate? That's absurd. This is completely different. They could own property of their own that was not their master's nor their master's authority to touch. They could purchase their freedom for the cost of their living. If a slave is murdered, regardless, and I looked this up because there was one thing that came in question, and I've heard it before. Exodus 21:20 deals with this. If a slave is murdered, the cost is a life. If anybody is murdered, the cost is a life. So you can't murder them. Abduction of a person, even a Canaanite, for slavery is the death penalty. So if you were to abduct a Canaanite, it is a death penalty. This is not slavery. The Jubilee was to be honored, but the Jews refused. And you'll find that God cursed them because they would not honor the Jubilee of freedom every 7th year in Jeremiah 34:8-16. God sent them into slavery, because real slavery, because they did not obey the law of bondmen in Jeremiah. So you can't say that this is the same thing. But there's more. That's only point 2. There's point 2. So now that's just the Old Testament. But when it gets really cool is the New Testament. The New Testament is far clearer on this topic, and the New Testament has stronger standards than the Old Testament. And this is where the argument comes into play, and this is where I believe people don't understand the Bible. The people that debate it. So the Bible talks about this phrase, and Jesus mentions this phrase, that it was for the hardness of their hearts that divorce and remarriage was allowed. Well, it's for the hardness of the hearts that slavery was allowed too. It was for the hardness of the hearts that lots of things were allowed in the Old Testament. And this is the same way with many of the laws. And so this was done away with in the New Testament. Many people will accept divorce and then say how awful slavery, divorce and remarriage, and they'll say how awful slavery is. They both have their root in the New Testament. And that's what's so important. You can't make an argument against divorce and remarriage in the Old Testament. Yet Christians today will say differently. And it gets more to that. Matthew 19, verse 7-9, and there's a lot of things that are that way. So I want you to read this. This is from Christ's mouth. He's going to respond. They say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of divorcement and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery. And whoso marrieth her, which is put away, doth commit adultery. And this is prophesied. So once again, you see that phrase, hardness of heart? Now listen to Jeremiah. This is really neat. Jeremiah 31:33. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, the days of the Lord, Jesus Christ, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. So first their heart was hardened, right? Let's listen to Paul, 2 Corinthians 3:3. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. Not stone, not hard. There's a tenderness after Jesus Christ. Christ created that tenderness. He created that example. So how do we know, and I'm going to go through the list. So how do we know that, okay, the Old Testament was different than the New Testament? First off, let's just go through the Sermon on the Mount. If you listen to the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to find plenty of instances where Jesus very clearly mentions these things. First off, hypocrisy. Whosoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and shall teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now you'll find many kings where that was not the case in the Old Testament. Hypocrisy was not a major issue, but Jesus says, no, you're going to be the least if you're a hypocrite. Then there's extreme righteousness that Jesus commands. For I say unto you that except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. So now, whenever you talk about this, he's saying these Pharisees have a really high standard of morality. And I'm going to show you from Josephus exactly what he states. Because many of us think the scribes and Pharisees, they had lots of laws and rules and regulations. But then you also had another sect called the Essenes. How many of you have heard of the Essenes before? Not too many have heard of the Essenes. Very few people have heard of them. And I'm going to show you who they are. Now I'm going to read from Josephus. They were zealots. The Pharisees have delivered to the people a many great observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses. The Pharisees are the direct lineage of the Jews today. They are the direct lineage of the Jews today. So when you say Pharisee, that's the Jews of today. They weren't even required to be Jewish. And you'll find that Rabbi Akiva and Yeshiva, both of those rabbis, or not Kokba, both of those rabbis were actually Gentiles. They weren't even Jews. And they're the two most reputable Jews in the Jewish faith. And they're not even Jewish. So it's kind of interesting. Either way, but these are the Pharisees, right? And now for the Pharisees, they live meanly. This is Josephus again. And despise delicacies in diet. And they follow the conduct of reason. And what that prescribes to them as good, for them they do, and they think they ought earnestly to strive to observe reason's dictates for practice. They also pay respect to such as are in years. Now are they so bold as to contradict them in anything which they have introduced. And when they determine that all things are done by fate, they do not take away the freedom from men of acting as such as they think fit. So, there you have one group of people called the Pharisees. And there's another sect called the Jews. And remember, this is going all the way back to righteousness exceeding that of the scribes and Pharisees. Josephus writes about another group of people whose righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. There's a group called the Essenes. And if you know anything about the Qumran caves and the Qumran finding of the caves and all of those ancient scrolls, there came a day, and if you've read up about it, you'll find that lots of the most ancient scrolls come from the Qumran caves. And you'll find Textus Receptus, not Textus Receptus, but the, help me out, Eric. What's the Old Testament text? Not the Vulgate, that's Latin. What? No, Masoretic, not Erasmus. Masoretic text, what we use today. You'll find the Masoretic text preserved right there in the Qumran caves. I had to get it right, I'm sorry. You'll find two different texts. You'll find the Masoretic and you'll find the Sinaiticus text. There, obviously it's not from Sinai. But the point is you'll find that same text, it matches. Well, one of them is perfectly preserved and in mint condition as though it were never used. That's the Sinaiticus, and then you have the Masoretic, which is definitely heavily used. So anyways, this all comes from a place called the Qumran Caves in the east. And there were a few thousand people who lived there, and Josephus talks about these individuals. And these were extremely righteous people. And they happened to believe, these Essenes believed that the temple was corrupt. And you couldn't offer sacrifice in the temple anymore. Which is interesting because Jesus said the same thing. And you'll find that there was a certain man that was known for a beard and eating locusts and wild honey. And he came out of the east in the desert. He came from the Qumran desert. Most people believe that he was one of these people who was from this area in the Qumran caves. And if you want to look that up, you're more than welcome to do so. So this Essenes, so now he talks about the Essenes. Listen to this. This sounds just like we do today. And so now all of a sudden here you have Josephus writing about the Essenes. The doctrine of the Essenes is this, that all things are best ascribed to God. They teach the immortality of souls and esteem the reward of righteousness. They esteem that the rewards of righteousness are to be earnestly striven for. And when they send what they have dedicated to God into the temple, they do not offer sacrifices because they have more pure lustrations of their own. So he's saying they are more pure than the people that are in the temple. On which account they are excluded from the common court of the temple, but offer their sacrifices themselves. Yea, is their course of life better than that of other men? And they entirely addict themselves to husbandry. And it has also deserved the admiration how much they exceed all other men that addict themselves to virtue. They exceed all other virtuous men. And now it's interesting, it also mentions husbandry, which is what they would do with the vine. What did Jesus talk about the most? Was it not the vine? What did John the Baptist talk about first? Was it not the fact of them laying an axe to a tree? That involves the act of husbandry. Have you ever wondered why it seems to be the old farmers just seem to have a real good connection with God? It's because it's been a tradition. It's been handed down for at least 2,000 years. Husbandry. And this in righteousness, and indeed to such a degree that as it hath never appeared among any other men, no virtue, no other men were as virtuous as these, neither Greeks nor barbarians, no, not for a little time, so hath it endured a long while among them. This is demonstrated by that institution of theirs which will not suffer anything to hinder them from having all things in common, so that a rich man enjoys no more of his own wealth than he who hath nothing at all. Sound familiar? I'm going to finish with this phrase, and then we're going to come back in the afternoon. There are about 4,000 men that live in this way, and neither marry wives, nor are desirous to keep servants, as they... Wait, let's read that again. Nor are desirous to keep servants. This is where we come from. This is where John the Baptist came from. This is where our faith comes from. So this is by Josephus, a secondhand source, telling you all the way back then that the writers of the Bible, of the New Testament, were against having any form of servant. So once again, it says, there are about 4,000 men that live this way that neither, I'm going to get there. I lost my spot. I had my finger there, and I moved it back and forth. Okay. They neither marry wives, so this is where monkhood comes from, nor are desirous to keep servants, as thinking the latter tempts men to be unjust. They thought the very fact of having a servant, though it were lawful, tempted men to be unjust. This is where our heritage comes from. They're the ones who preserve the oldest text that we have of the Bible. This is that same sect of people. And the former gives the handle to domestic quarrels. So they say the reason why is we know that there's domestic quarrels. They didn't condemn it, but they said we are going to be wholly devoted to God instead of marriage. But as they live by themselves, they minister one to another. They also appoint certain stewards to receive the incomes of their revenues and of the fruits of the ground, such as are good men and priests, who are to get their corn and their food ready for them. They, none of them, differ from others of the Essenes in their way of living, but do the most resemble those of Decay, who are of Polystay, basically dwellers in cities. So this is where that monk nature comes from. You wonder where it comes from and why there's been since the beginning of the church, there's been a promotion on celibacy for men or for women, one or the other. It comes from this group of people all the way back then. They said, you know what, we need to separate ourselves, and they built something that was very unique to Christianity. And you'll find that many of the apostles ended up being this very same way. And you'll find that not only were the apostles that way, but John the Baptist, Jesus Christ. And this was something that was unique to the Essenes in their way of living, because they were interested solely in the preservation of God's word. They were a different group of people. And with that being said, we're talking about slavery. And so it's obvious right there that where we get our heritage from, they were anti-slavery. They didn't even believe in servants, Jewish bondmen. Let alone, could you imagine what they would have thought about slavery? That being said, I'm going to have you please stand, and we're going to finish up tonight. It's going to be a lot shorter, the rest of it. So you're